In today's video, we're going to be talking about the tripartite division of the soul, which is Plato's idea of the soul being split into three parts. You have the rational, the appetitive, and the spirited. In this video, we're going to be talking about what the tripartite division of the soul is, how it's influenced later thinkers, and finally talk about its implications to us as we live. Plato's idea of the tripartite division of the soul, as the name suggests, is the idea that the soul is split into three parts, tripartite. And the soul, being split into three parts, are split into these parts of the rational soul, the appetitive soul, and the spirited soul. In his dialogue, you could find this distinction in the Republic and also his Phaedrus, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. In the Republic, where he goes into a lot of depth into this tripartite division of the soul, he talks about the idea of ourselves having a motivational conflict within ourselves. Sometimes we desire to eat food, we're hungry. Sometimes we think and desire to seek knowledge. Sometimes we desire to seek honor, status, and wealth. Due to these conflicts, Plato then makes the argument that there are indeed three different parts of us. For example, he would say, well, all right, when I'm hungry but I need to do my homework, I've decided to do my homework over my hunger. But since I cannot be at once in contradiction with myself, that means my soul cannot have two parts which are running against each other, or at least the same part of the soul cannot be running against each other. We must identify those two different drives which are in conflict and then posit two different drives. As a result, he says, well, when I want to eat instead of doing my homework, well, my homework-loving side of me is the rational, whereas my I am hungry, I want to eat side is my appetitive. Likewise, the spirited, the honored side of it would be like, well, all right, I am hungry, I'm starving, but I am in a very high reputable restaurant. I'm not going to pull out some nuts, or I'm not going to pull out some McDonald's in this 3-star Michelin restaurant and start stuffing myself with a McDonald's burger. Why? Well, because my perceived idea of the social status is more important than the appetitive. Likewise, you might think, well, all right, my foot is really hurting in this business meeting. The rational side would say, well, I should go to a doctor, whereas the social side will say, well, I need to carry on this business meeting. I need to carry on this business affair. So you can notice that what Plato's trying to do is to play on these conflicts and these perhaps contradictions between our different drives to make the argument for the case that there are three different drives. Now, he doesn't just say there's three different drives or three different parts of the soul which are in conflict with each other, and whatever way they engage with each other is the best way forward. What Plato wants to do is to take us further in this tripartite division of the soul and to say, well, actually the soul is most healthy when we have the rational in front. And this is where the Phaedrus comes in, where he says, well, okay, this is the analogy of the charioteer. There's a man holding two horses, controlling two horses to pull his chariot forward. He then talks about the man being the rational soul, controlling the appetitive and the spirited. You have the rational soul guiding and directing these horses forward. And he says this is the society, or this is the person which works or is functioning in the best possible form. It's when we submit the appetitive and the spirited to the rational, which allows us to make the right decisions or live the proper life, to live the good life. And in fact, if you're looking at Plato's overall metaphysics and his overall epistemology, what he's arguing is that when you have the tripartite division of the soul, when you have the rational as its lead and not the appetitive or the spirited, only then can the soul slowly and direct itself, attune itself towards truth in the long term. And therefore, the man, if you think about Plato's allegory of the cave, is able to move from the cave or the land of the shadows, realm of the shadows, to understand and contemplate the form, which is the understanding of the truth, the contemplation of the good life. And that is only done when the rational is in charge of the body. The rational part of the soul is indeed in charge of the body. Now you might say, hold up a second, Josh. This seems very familiar. Where have I learned this from, or what else comes close to this tripartite division of the soul? Well, the answer is it is quite similar to Freud, the great psychoanalyst's concept of the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, the id to Freud is the idea of one's drives, one's sexual drives mostly, as Freud likes to put it. But it's one's innate drives that of what one wants to pursue. which as a result, as I've said, is most often sexual, but of course it could be kind of physical, I want to eat, stuff like that. Then you have the superego, which is on the other side. I guess you could tie that to the spirited to say, well, all right, this is the cultural norms, my conceived idea of cultural norms. This is what my parents have taught me. This is what society expects of me. And then you have the ego, which kind of balances between the great ideal of the social norms. And then you have the id as this, I guess, this baseness, and the ego in turn, I suppose, as a rational, wants to balance between the two. Now, that is quite similar to Plato in the sense that, well, all right, there's this rough symmetry between the two. You have the superego to the spirited, you have the appetitive to the id, and then you have the rational to the ego. But then that's not exactly the best way to look at it in the sense, if someone said, okay, well, the ego actually is the rational to Plato, that would be incorrect. And the reason for why that would be incorrect is because in Freud, you have the ego as kind of this mediative, this necessary mediative balancer between the id and the superego, whereas for Plato, it's not necessarily the case that the ego or the rational has to be in charge of the appetitive and the spirited. In fact, in most situations, actually, this is what the second half, or if not the last bit of the whole Republic is about, is to say that most people don't actually have the rational in control, whereas to Freud, the ego is that which balances. Almost ego by definition is that which balances and is constrained by the superego and the id. What to Plato is to say, well, these three can be balanced in any which way possible. You can have someone where the appetitive is in charge, or you have someone else where the spirit is in charge. You have someone else where the rational is in charge. In fact, it's the rarest case, only in the Society of the Philosopher Kings, or only in the just person, the philosopher, where the rational is in charge. So you have this whole different dynamic of the relationship between each of this tripartite division, which therefore makes Plato's idea slightly separate, and I would argue more accurate than Freud's conception. So now we've seen kind of the similarities between Freud and Plato, but also the differences between them, which is very important. So that leads us on to our final discussion. Why is this so important? Why is it helpful to think about the tripartite division of the soul? The reason why it's so important to think about the tripartite division of the soul is because it helps us understand ourselves. This is not, and I don't think it's helpful to think about Plato as making metaphysical claim. He's not like, oh, if you had a metaphysical view of the soul, perhaps in a Christian theist sense, you're going to find three parts of it. Nor from a biological sense, if someone cuts up your mind, they're not going to see, oh, that's your rational mind, that's your appetitive mind, that's your spirited mind. Now, with modern developments in biology and psychobiology, people probably have some kind of way to look into your brain waves or biochemistry, whatever, and look into that and be like, okay, hold up a second, certain parts of your brains are activated based on your understanding of reason, your understanding of hunger, okay, you might be able to find those connections there. But I don't think Plato is making that argument, nor should we say, oh my gosh, Plato's so smart that he predicted all these biochemical connotations in the future. That's not what we're trying to look at in Plato. Rather, what I think we should be looking at for Plato is to say, well, actually what Plato was so good at was to recognize our desires when we're analyzing ourselves, when we're trying to improve ourselves. What actually are we being driven by? We constantly ask yourselves, what is my motivation for doing this? When I decide to write my paper, what am I being driven by? When I want to find a girlfriend, what am I driven by? When I'm trying to improve myself, when I want to improve my relationships, what am I being driven by? By questioning yourselves with these motivations, you then start to think, well, actually this tripartite division is quite helpful. Am I being driven purely by my lust? Am I purely driven by my social status? Am I only with this person because I think my friends will like me being with this person? Am I only doing this, maybe I'm being an investment banker because I want money and that's the spirited side? Why am I doing this? Now that's a very helpful thing. The tripartite division of the soul is helpful in reflecting. And as a result, Anthony Kenny makes this argument in his book, Mental Health in Plato's Republic, is to talk about how can we manage these drives in such a way that it is desirable for our well-being. How can we manage and understand these different motivations which do exist in our human souls to achieve the best purpose and the best mental health going forward? And that's a question that I would like to leave with you after we've discussed tripartite division of the soul. What part of the soul do you find yourselves controlled most by? Is it the rational? Is it the appetitive? Is it spirited? And in what circumstances are they the most important? Because sometimes I am driven by the rational, sometimes I'm driven by the appetitive, sometimes I'm driven by the spirited. So these are important questions to ask yourselves, and I would like to leave you with that question. If you liked this video about Plato, make sure to like and subscribe. And also let me know in the comments below what else of Plato would you want me to talk about. I could talk about the Euthyphro dilemma. I could talk more about his city-soul analogy. or in the future, we're going to be going to Heidegger next. So let me know what you want to think about that as well. I would love to introduce those ideas to you. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video. God bless and goodbye.